Probably the scariest words I've ever heard in my life were just uttered, which is, if anybody knows Rick Bennett. I almost got up and ran out here. We're glad to be here today on behalf of the panel. This is a very important topic, not only cybersecurity and ethics, but also, the bigger umbrella, cybersecurity. When we started talking about this a few months back, it was important, but now what's going on in our world, it's even heightened. I'm going to tease one of our panelists that's here today, Matthew. He stepped in for us at the last moment, and we appreciate that. And he said that he will answer any questions that anybody has today because he retires tomorrow. So he's not afraid of being on the record. So make the questions very interesting. And on that note, I do want to introduce our panel. From left to right, we have Erin Rogers. She is an SVP at BOKF in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's Bank of Oklahoma Financial. So welcome. We have Kent Nabors, the CSIO at Hobby Lobby. And for those who do not know CISO, that's the Chief Information Security Officer, otherwise known as one of the most in-demand career opportunities right now in the world. And then we have Matthew Harper, the CISO at Devon Energy. And we also have Matt Singleton with us. So welcome. We appreciate you being here. So what I love most about this panel, and it was deliberate, is the diversity that they bring, meaning that we have representation from banking, we have representation from retail, oil and gas, and then government. And what you'll hear in this presentation is unique perspectives, right? There is no one right answer. There are different answers for different businesses given the risk associated with the situation for the company's profile. We will be getting into a variety of topics that you saw published in the agenda. We're going to talk about employee investigations. We're going to talk about background checks. We're going to talk about monitoring. We're going to talk about profiling and biases, and then we're going to talk about cybersecurity as it relates to ESG. So we'll jump right in, and we'll start with Erin. Employee investigations. What processes do we utilize to ensure privacy is maintained when our cybersecurity staff participates in employee investigations?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having us today. Really appreciate the invite. I would say for us, as a member of a banking organization, we take the privacy of not only our customers' information, but also our employees' information very seriously. And so whenever there is the need of an investigation, I think the biggest thing that... Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Whenever we do have an investigation, I think the most important thing is kind of limiting the number of individuals involved in the process. So kind of keeping it on a need-to-know basis. For us, for example, we have one specific individual in information security that's involved, one specific individual in IT that's involved, and there's really no one else outside that. Because as you start to kind of grow that group, it's just a larger chance that there's maybe a little side chatter here and there, so just kind of keeping it to a need-to-know basis. And then also for our investigations, we're just kind of collecting the information, encrypting it, and we send it on to our external legal counsel. They're the ones who are actually going through maybe different files or kind of going through the different information. So we kind of leave that to them, and so we kind of keep it a little bit separate from us.
Very good. Thank you. Kent?
Yeah, the other phenomenon with technology is if it's got a power plug, you're expected to know how to fix it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right. But having proper authorization, because a lot of times technology people may be the ones who found an indicator of needing a requirement for an investigation. Okay. But just because IT finds that isn't where the investigation begins. So an investigation should come from a human resources or a legal first that provides authorization before there's an investigation done. And then very similar to BOK, we're very limited on who participates in those things. People are specialized, people that are tenured, and they stay within their specialty when required for investigation. So it's really about controls and authorization.
Very good. Thank you. Matthew?
I think maybe I'll pull together a couple things that Erin and Kent said. In our organization, we actually have an investigations policy that lines out which parts of the organization are authorized to participate or initiate. It's the groups you would think of: HR, legal, internal audit, cybersecurity, corporate security. And within that, there's boundaries. We do run most of what we operate in through legal. It protects privilege. We also have a ethics software suite that creates a secure place for that data to go. It creates a reporting portal for people to anonymously or with attribution report things. And so we do keep a tight circle. I do include more people in training how to do investigations. So one, it creates some continuity, but it demystifies it a little bit so they don't snoop around. And then we have some checks and balances to make sure people aren't overstepping their bounds.
Very good. And Matt?
So I'm batting cleanup on this one, apparently. I'm not going to restate everything the previous panelists said because they're dead on. Exactly the measures that should be in place. One of the things that I would highlight, though, is the need for, actually, I'll go back to the lady that was given the guiding principles earlier. Establishing values within your cybersecurity team that's doing the investigations, and one of those probably should be integrity, right? And then reinforcing those values at every step, whether it's through hiring or performance evaluations, and then holding them to that expectation, right? So, one of my favorite quotes from, I think it's Leif Babin that wrote Extreme Ownership says, standards are not set by what you preach, but what you tolerate. So if you set those expectations with your staff around the values that you're going to adhere to, integrity, privacy, those types of things, and if you do have a misstep, you need to hold those individuals accountable so the rest of the team understands, yep, that actually is important.
Very good. Thank you. So the next question is kind of a follow-on. Background checks. So does your company participate in background checks related to cybersecurity staff? And if so, how do you address the dilemma of privacy and ethics associated with such a practice?
Yes, we do background checks, but we don't do anything different for cybersecurity versus for other technology jobs. So we're very consistent in what you do if you're doing cybersecurity versus another role. But a background check is like, the ante up in poker. It's just the first step. Really what we're talking about is trying to figure out how do you find the right people for your team. And so most often what we do is, think of baseball metaphors. We use a farm team system where getting onto the security team is not something that we generally hire straight out from outside. Because one of the important things is Hobby Lobby has a unique culture, and so we want someone who understands Hobby Lobby first, and then we'll bring on technical skills and we'll bring on those other things. And so a lot of times we'll bring in people from help desk or development or some other role in the company that has a different kind of expertise and bring them into cybersecurity because it's really more important about what kind of a team member are you first,
Okay.
and then we bring you in.
Very good. Matthew?
Our organization certainly does background investigations. A lot of it is really driven around the safety culture. We deal in some dangerous operations. We want to be able to protect the environment. We want to make sure that people have good traffic records, things like that. There's a byproduct of whether they have a criminal record or not. And then there's a whole myriad of other things you could get into. And the issue of background checks, while I think they're a good triage, it's actually getting super complex with changing drug laws, with allegations versus convictions, with what's the type of role. So after the initial employment background, we actually have some discretion based on the role as to whether there's recurring backgrounds. And so obviously people in more sensitive roles are more subject to that, get more scrutiny. But I've found it's, having some experience in the government side and the intelligence community, it's very different in the corporate side than the intrusiveness of what goes into some of the other roles that you can get into.
Yeah, with that, nice segue. Thank you, Matthew. So in state government, we do background checks. Actually, so within the state of Oklahoma, there are, and don't quote me on the number because it changes every time the crazy people down the street meet, 189 different agencies, right? And so each of them is responsible for kind of setting their own standards. My parent agency, we say, yep, every employee that comes on is going to go through a standard background check. If you're in IT, we have additional checks that we do based off what you have access to in terms of the data, in terms of your level of access, your elevated rights, that sort of thing, or different locations within the data center, right? So if I'm going to let you on the raised floor space in the data center where all the stuff is, you have to be at a different level. And we actually do some of those very invasive things that Matthew talked about. To go to the question around privacy, how do you respect people's privacy when you're being invasive? Very carefully. Really what it comes down to is the folks that are stepping into those roles have some expectation that their privacy is going to be invaded, right? So within Cyber Command, we actually run people through a full FBI, NCIC, fingerprint, background check. Some roles actually require a secret clearance. And, you know, they go interview your kindergarten teacher and your next door neighbors and that sort of stuff. Those people are expecting that level of thoroughness when they apply for the job. So I guess I didn't really answer the question. Again, it's about expectations, right? If you're walking in and you're expecting to be invaded, your privacy to be invaded, then maybe it's not that important. Yeah.
Very good. All right, Erin.
Thanks. So I think for us, our level of background checks are pretty similar, I think, to the state. So it's not only kind of the criminal investigation and background history, but also we do credit history checks as well as drug testing. And so because I think we're equal opportunity, everyone gets a check. Doesn't matter if you're the CEO or a teller with our organization. But, you know, for us, for kind of keeping it private, you know, I think you talk about it as, you know, this is kind of like a precursor to employment, but I think you also need to kind of think about how do you kind of keep monitoring folks even after their employment. And so this is really kind of where that insider threat program can kind of come into play. And so whether someone is maybe an accidental insider or a malicious insider, you know, how do you kind of keep that check and that monitoring on those individuals? And just a quick story. I know of an individual who was subjected to some drug testing after his employment. The company that he had worked for, they do both random and sometimes requested drug testing. And he, needless to say, did not pass the test. Well, somehow or another, word kind of got out, and you know, it was a situation where it kind of became a little bit more of gossip and a joke at this organization and about this individual. And so I think there's a real need to keep things private, but again, it probably goes back to some of the principles that we were talking about earlier, and also having expectations set between maybe HR and the managers that are involved in the process, and making sure that they understand the level of discretion that is needed in these types of situations, and whether that's through policy or just kind of level setting and saying, this information does not leave this room, as far as the reasons if someone does become subject to involuntary termination.
Good. Thank you. Probably one of the biggest disadvantages to the pandemic and working from home for myself is that I might have watched Dr. Phil on occasion. So I find myself wanting to ask certain questions as this goes on, and almost channeling Dr. Phil for a moment. So I'm going to throw you a curveball. We have great diversity as far as the different industries that we serve, but one thing I realized as we're going through this question, and some of the others, is that we don't have a lot of diversity as far as large enterprise, small enterprise, right? So could we back up a moment on this last question of background checks? And for the audience, what would you say for a smaller company who has one or two IT people, or maybe they use an outsourced firm? How can they address the question of background checks? And I'll just put that out there for the panel.
I mean, one of the things you could certainly do is OSBI, for a fee, will give you a background check. You could do a bring your own situation. We've done that with some nonprofits that we've worked with,
Okay.
particularly when they involve kids. You bring, you know, if you coach a sport, you bring your own background check to the organization if it's affiliated with a nonprofit or religious entities. So that was one idea I will offer.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, to the later portion of your question around if you outsourced your IT, how would you handle that? That really gets into third-party risk management. You should be doing some level of assessment on the people that are providing services to your company. And as part of that, you should request some sort of a background check. And I would tell you way more than that, but at the very least, make sure that that's part of the requirement for doing business with you, is that those employees are going through some sort of a check.
So one thing on my side, one of the things is I also have a small business my wife and I own, and talk about very limited resources as compared to Hobby Lobby, 10 employees versus 45,000. There is an element of risk when you go smaller down the scale because you don't have those resources. And so you do find yourself having to do like a public resource that you can do to do some basic checks, the magic of Google, but at some point you have to just say, I've got to take a risk, make a judgment, and then have the courage to make decisions based on those risks that you've taken and what the results are from that. So a lot of this is just, are you building in the values in your company, be it 10 people or 45,000 people, that give you the ability to make those judgments early on in a relationship and not preserve those problems that may occur.
Very good. All right. Another thing that I learned during the pandemic was I'm recently married, so my coworker at home for a couple of years was my new wife. And she would listen to a lot of Teams calls that I was on, and she would say that I have a very bad habit of saying, are there any questions? And then I would continue the conversation. And so I learned, and I even put in a slide in my notes to answer questions and to pause and to listen. And that was really good feedback from her. There are some great questions, so thank you. And also thank you for respecting that I'm 57 and my eyes are failing and writing nice and big on these sheets. So we're going to pause, and I'm going to throw you some questions from the audience, okay? And we don't have to have the entire panel answer, just if you feel that you have something that you can contribute, jump in. So how does social political activism impact cybersecurity decisions at your company or organization?
I think we're all going to have a perspective on this, but we operate, particularly these days in a world where politics drives a lot of people's emotions and behaviors, and understanding that and respecting that is part of a good, healthy cybersecurity program. For us, obviously, we're trying our best to respect the environment. We operate in a number of jurisdictions where people have very different political views on things. And so understanding that and being the best neighbor you can be at any given time is really helpful. We're also doing a lot more effort on our ESG programs that really kind of proactively states where we stand on issues. And being transparent, helps manage that. But there's no silver bullet on that because, for every good intention you have, there's somebody that has a completely different opinion. And to quote another author, we judge ourselves by our intentions, others judge us by our actions. And so you have to make sure you're walking the talk.
So early in my Hobby Lobby career, I learned this phenomenon personally. So 2014, Hobby Lobby, you may know, went to all the way to the Supreme Court fighting the Obama administration on the health care bill. That was before I joined Hobby Lobby. 2016, 2017, somewhere in there, President Trump nominated Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. Well, I did not know this at the time, but that day, cyber attacks on the company, social things posting, and I was trying to figure out what was going on. Well, Kavanaugh was an appellate court judge in that 2014 case. So when Trump took an action, I'll walk in and thinking it's a normal day, and Hobby Lobby did nothing. We were just sitting there, but the president made a decision, and because of that decision, it had a tangential relationship to a case that Hobby Lobby was involved in years prior. and suddenly cybersecurity was an issue for the company. So you cannot predict how these things will happen. It can be an executive that gives a speech, it could be an employee that posts a Twitter message that gets taken out of context or in context, and suddenly your day is different. So one of the things is, building a strong team, building a strong defense, having core values that you know what you will stand up for, because sometimes you're going to be in disagreement with society and you just have to say, that's what I am, and just continue to state, this is what I am. But yes, it is a fast-changing world, and you don't know when you're going to be tested, so you just have to be ready.
All right. This next one ties to that, because you said you don't ever know, when you need to be ready. So this ties nicely. Do you know if there is insurance coverage available for cybersecurity issues, and is it worth the cost?
Yes, no, maybe. Yes, there is insurance available. The rules are changing. Getting cybersecurity insurance for a while was not very hard. And then as the insurance carriers started to discover that they actually had to start writing checks, they got a little more stringent in how they wrote policies. And so it was interesting going through some conversations I had with carriers just a year ago was a completely different thing than what I had just a few months ago. The rules of this world change constantly, and because of that, if you got to write a check, suddenly you change how you ask questions. As to the value of it, it really depends on your risk profile, but I will tell you the risks of ransomware in particular are dramatic for companies. And when you think, well, the bad guys won't target me, I'm not that interesting, you are that interesting. You really are. So there are some real reasons for why you would pursue an insurance policy like that. But at the same time, you have to think about how that fits your risk profile, how much you're willing to pay for that, mitigation. But yeah, it's not as easy to get as it used to be. And ironically, there was a story in the news recently that a major insurance carrier that underwrote cybersecurity was breached. And the risk to that, I will tell you to think about, is if a carrier is breached, they have the answers to all the questions you just gave about your security. So the bad guys now have a list to say, who am I going to go after? So risk is 1 and 2 and 3 moves down the field for who you do business with. So it's a complex environment.
Thank you.
Just as a disclaimer, I believe that we sell cybersecurity insurance as one of our products. So I don't know if I'm allowed to say that or not, but it's a very interesting topic, and the thing to probably consider is probably going around maybe the diversity and the size of your organization. I was talking with a group this past fall, and I told them, I said, we hear about these ransomware attacks in the news, and you hear about the colonial pipelines and kind of like some of these bigger stories, but really there was a study that was done, and I think it was in around October timeframe of last year. They said, the median size, company size, had approximately 50 employees, and so it's really those small to medium-sized businesses that are really being attacked. And so they're probably, coming up, and it's probably a little bit more of a likelihood. And if you think about it, the smaller the organization, you may have a very small cybersecurity team. And so there's only so much that you can do when it comes to protect and defend. But when it comes to the cyber insurance, it's just another protective measure for your organization and kind of creating some sort of resiliency as an organization, and having those policies in place. If you do need to invoke your policy and start it up, they can also help connect you with organizations that'll help you recover should something happen.
Okay. The best thing about this microphone is that as a moderator, we'd been talking earlier about how will I know when they want to contribute something to the conversation. But the microphone, if they reach for it, we're good. If they don't, they don't.
So I might just throw out one thing you want to keep in mind. If you do choose to go after a cyber policy, read the policy. I know it's probably obvious, but a lot of them have a clause in there that said acts of war are not covered.
Ooh.
And so as we're, you mentioned the geopolitical dynamics that we're dealing with right now. That's a nice way of talking about what's going on over there. it would be really easy to make a case that some of the advanced persistent threats that we're dealing with, some of the threat actor groups may be acting on behalf of a foreign government. And so just kind of keep that in mind if you're making the decision to make the investment. Is your organization likely to be targeted by one of these groups? And if so, make sure you read the fine print.
20 seconds here. Keep in mind also, cyber insurance doesn't come in one package. For our organization, it's 4 pieces of coverage. There's a D&O piece for your directors and officers. There's a crime policy that covers some things and not others. There's the data breach policy that is probably what you're thinking of when you think of a cyber policy. And then there's a business interruption policy that covers a gamut of things. And together they provide a blanket of coverage. They all have different deductibles, retentions. They all have different caps. They all have different amount of time before they kick in. So some of them you can't call them until you have 24 hours of interruption or you've lost X amount of money. And then when the insurance company comes, they also have a perspective on how you respond. So you may not get to pick your favorite incident response. You may not get to pick your data breach counsel. You may not get to pick your PR firm. So some things to know. Read the policy.
Very good. I'm so glad that we paused for questions because these questions are really good. So thank you for that. I'm going to keep going through them and we'll have some fun. In light, and we touched on this a bit ago, in light of recent world events, how concerned are each of you that a significant cyber attack is going to occur toward the U.S., the power grid, et cetera? And as I was reading this earlier, I was thinking about America Has Talent, or one of those shows where all the panelists reach in and hit the buzzer at the same time. I think we all would agree, very concerned. But I'm interested in your perspective.
I'll use this as one of my opportunities to speak freely.
It's going to get good.
I've spent most of my professional career dealing with attacks from Russia and China, and studied that in college and things like that. I fully expect that there will be some event that most of us will feel as a supply chain type event, very similar to a colonial. And it's probably something that we wouldn't expect would interrupt our daily lives. But we're already having challenges with getting products into the U.S. post-pandemic. It may be the opposite direction. It may be trouble getting exports out and something that interrupts a cash flow for an industry or an organization. But this is a tool that can be used that has a non-specific response to it. And so when you're dealing with foreign powers that don't really want the full weight and force of the U.S. military, this is a tool they have in their toolbox. I think they're likely to pull it out and swing this particular hammer at some point.
So I would say that we're always keeping an eye on threat actors from Russia and China. So it's probably a little bit like another day in the office from that aspect. But I think what is going on, today, it's really interesting because I think for the first time we have a war that's going on, but it's maybe, I've heard it described as maybe a hybrid war. So traditionally you think of war and military action and it's, tanks and, the bombs and the missiles and so forth. But today you have that piece of it, but there's also a cyber war that's going on at the same time. And so maybe this is like the first real incident where you have two sovereign nations and we're trying to consider the cyber impact of it. And, I made a comment to my boss earlier and I said, with this, we had, in World War II, victory gardens, right? And so everyone realized, hey, we need to do our part for the country and defenses. And, for us, we're really trying to impress upon not only our employees, but also our customers and just kind of the greater community that everybody needs to be pretty aware of what's going on, especially from a cyber perspective. And so whether that is, having conversations with your children or like I'm having conversations with my 75-year-old father trying to explain phishing emails to him, but everybody kind of needs to do their part in having good cybersecurity practices because I believe that that's kind of our version of victory gardens when it comes to what we're kind of seeing today with both Russia and China.
Yes. We all got something to say. So one other aspect to this is it's not really just two actors in this environment. I mean, Anonymous, this nebulous group of hackers, has been taking a side and taking actions. And, you know, if your neighbor puts his house on fire, you're going to be concerned. Well, today on the internet, everybody is your neighbor. A data packet from Okmulgee to Oklahoma City and a data packet from Chisinau, Moldova to Oklahoma City is the same thing. So the unintended consequences of this is really what worries me, is supply chains, infrastructure, things like that that can really have spill-on effects. So we really do all need to think about resilience. What is our position about how we can prepare ourselves, you know, food supplies, cash, those kinds of basic things just to be ready.
So I'm going to build on some of the comments that Erin was making there. We have a saying within our team, cybersecurity is a team sport, because it really is. It takes everybody pulling their weight. The United States as a nation probably has some of the most advanced offensive capabilities when it comes to cyber war, but we're also by far the most vulnerable to those types of attacks as well because of how connected our society is. Think about, you know, do you have a smart thermostat in your home? Do you have a door, a Ring doorbell? All those things are connected back to the internet. And so everything's interconnected. And so an attack here may have ripple effects that you may not even envision. So and I'm going to get my soapbox out for just a second, but each of us have a responsibility as a citizen to do right in cyberspace. We should practice appropriate cyber hygiene. If you don't already, have a unique and complex password for every system. Every web page that you visit, if it requires a username and password, it should be different. Use a password manager. If you do have smart stuff in your house that's connected to your network, patch it. Change the default password on your Linksys router at home. Everybody knows it's admin to admin. They can get right in. Take the time to actually do those types of things in your home so that you can secure your area, and then you can better the entire community as a result of that. Those are probably the two biggest things you can do. Make sure you've got antivirus on your home computer. Make sure you're backing up the stuff that you care about, because you could quickly be ransomed at home. You'll lose all those family pictures, your finances, right? I mean, if it's important to you, back it up, keep it offline. I'll stop now, sorry.
Oh, very good, this is great. I've got two cards here with very similar questions, so I'm going to weave them together. When we talk about background checks, does that include reviewing social media? And then the next series of questions is, do you monitor employees' social media, and should you? And do you provide guidance to employees as to who they should friend and not friend? These are great questions. Thank you.
I'm going to answer this question, but not as an employee of my current company. So I tell my team, you can do anything once, but you have to live with the consequences. Social media is such a large part of our world, we almost have to treat it as though it's similar to how we would interact with other humans. And I, in my professional career, have come across a number of times where a person's social media presence is reflecting who they are masking in a work environment. And so I've had situations where I couldn't in good conscience leave somebody leading a team that had a set of views that were contrary to the culture we're trying to drive at our organizations. And so I think that has to be an element of it. Now, as far as do you monitor their social media, the balance I think that works really well that I would encourage you to consider is maybe not actively monitor it. You don't need to check somebody's Facebook or Instagram or whatever minute to minute. But if they give you a reason to go check it, if you get an ethics complaint about it, if you have a HR event that makes somebody uncomfortable, that's a data point. And I think it's fair game if that's who they're expressing as in public. It may lead to something like an unwelcome work environment or a harassment situation that really needs to be addressed. And shame on you if you don't use all the information that is available to you to, drive the right behaviors and culture in your organization. So I've seen it go very badly when somebody missed all the cues, where somebody was either crying out for help or, explaining exactly who they are in very certain terms, and it caused trouble for the organizations because they didn't act on it.
Any other? I think collectively we all are going to delete our Facebook accounts after that outstanding response. Thank you. How many ransom requests are there, or ransomware requests are there on average? Is it recommended to pay ransom if you have your computer backed up? So let's talk about ransomware.
All right, I'll stick my toe in this water. So have your stuff backed up. Already said that. We would not recommend that you pay the ransom. And I think if you talk to any government organization, they're going to say the same thing. By paying the ransom, you're encouraging that behavior. You're actually feeding into these counter markets that are out there. You may be funding terrorist activity, something to keep in mind, and they may take your money and not give you your data anyway. So from my seat, back your stuff up.
There's no honor among thieves. Making a decision to pay is a very difficult decision, and you probably have to be in a very desperate place when you're at that point. So the first thing you can do is be ready with resilience, backing yourself up, having offline options so that you can be able to survive an attack like that. But when you are in that situation, I will just say it is a tough thing. I've had some friends who've had to make those calls, and it's a difficult thing when you're faced with existence or non-existence as a company, which it can be. And so it's tough, but I would say, one, don't trust the person on the other side of that negotiation. They may not be the only entity that's in your network. You think you're negotiating with one, there may be 2 or 3 bad guys in your environment. So fixing one problem may not solve their problem. So it's a high-risk thing to pay.
Yeah, and I would say I think the prevalent, guidance is, not paying, just for the reasons that were, stated before. And then also, there have also been instances of, even if they do give you a key to decrypt your data, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work quickly. There have definitely been instances where, companies have tried to decrypt their data, and it probably took just as long to decrypt it as it would to recreate the data. So, and then who's to say that they won't just do it again? We had a very valuable exercise this past year because we were getting a lot of questions around ransomware, and so we did a tabletop exercise with kind of the director, manager level within both IT and information security, and then they also did one at the executive level. So it was the CEO as well as all of his direct reports, and they were kind of going through these questions. Would we pay? Would we not pay? How would we handle this? So if that's something that your organization hasn't done yet, I would highly recommend it, just to kind of think through those questions, because you definitely do not want to be in the moment trying to figure out what should we do. You want to have that kind of plan ahead of time, should it happen to you.
Very good. All right, couple more questions. These are really good. I hope you all are enjoying kind of this random discussion. It's fun, and they're really good questions. I'm going to tie these two together. And it said, first, do you recommend password manager apps where the data is stored in the cloud versus stored directly on your PC? And before you answer that one, I'm going to fold in the next question. Is our cyber insurance carrier makes a broad statement that it requires multi-factor authentication? Would you provide some guidance as to how often that MFA should occur, and if it should be applied to logins and emails in the office, remotely, on the VPN, et cetera? So I knew if I went with just the password question, you'd tie it to MFA.
If you're technically proficient, I recommend a password manager. If you're not, you just create headaches for the rest of the world. As far as MFA, if you do not have MFA on your SaaS applications, your email, your VPN, your remote access, you're sheep. And the world needs sheep, but you will be breached. And cybersecurity professionals will have very little sympathy for you. This is a table stakes security control at this point. And probably 5 to 7 times a week, my team detects our vendors having those types of issues because real compromised accounts, real accounts from our suppliers are being used to communicate with our employees. So there's no fake email header or phishing tails because it is the real account from the vendor. And because they can read the email chain, they have context about what you're talking about. Fortunately, they usually do things like ask to change the pay to information or the address or something. So much of the multi-factor is a table stakes control, but it needs to be partnered with good treasury controls because this is a people problem. This is not a technology problem.
So this is definitely a big topic for us, especially being a financial organization. And, you know, I read some guidance somewhere and it literally said two-factor everything. But we definitely realize that not everyone can do that. There are some legacy systems that can provide their own challenges with it, but there's different levels of two-factor authentication as well. So there's a type where you get the code that is sent to, you know, your phone, or it'll give you a call back on your phone. But the best is if you're using some sort of application for the authentication. It's a push authentication. So if that is an option, that's probably the top one that you want to have. So that way you can avoid whether, you know, it's the SIM hack or, you know, something of that nature. And then, you know, also we just kind of going to what was said earlier about the good treasury controls. We had a great instance that I heard of where, you know, we do a lot of wires, and this is hundreds of millions of dollars that's kind of going back and forth every day. And so it's being able to not only see, you know, a phishing email where it's got misspellings and the header, you know, that we talked about, but understanding the context of those emails. And we had one that came in, everything looked correct, but when you start reading the email, the individual who spotted it realized, oh, this person said thank you at the end of the email. And the client that had supposedly sent this email was not known to be very personable or a very thankful person, and they thought, this is a little weird. They're a little bit more abrupt in their nature. And so that was the trigger for them. And just so kind of having that awareness was really the big key for us. But yes, we're big fans of MFA. Yes. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to go back on script now and ask some of our remaining questions, and then if there's time at the end, we'll do a little bit more Q&A. Next question is monitoring. How do you watch the watchers to ensure with those specialized, elevated privileges are not abusing their access, are not behaving ethically? So, Matt, would you like to kick us off on that?
Sure. So, really the way we've addressed it at the state is we have 2 of everything. We used to call it the Noah's Ark of IT, but it really is, and we make sure everybody knows we have 2 of everything. And really what it comes down to is the systems of record keep track of who's doing what when, right? There's an audit log on the actual system where the changes are happening. Simultaneously, that is feeding into a separate system that my team manages. And so if you're watching the watchers, it's important for them to know they're being watched. And so even if they were to go in and try to cover their tracks in one system, they don't have the same level of access in the other, and vice versa, right? I mean, it's entirely possible you've got a problem on this side. You still have the system of record that this team doesn't have access to over here.
So this is kind of a trust but verify situation that that as I see it, one of the tricks that we've used is getting creative about how we use our identity management system. And so while you have a powerful account in our organization, you don't get to have it forever. You have to, we have access reviews, those things are revoked. When you request elevated privileges, you give a reason. And then we also, very much like a bank would, we rotate roles. And so in our security operations center, we have a lead handler and then a handler on duty. So an incident response lead and a handler on duty. Those roles change either weekly or daily. And so there's a handoff and there's a chance to go back and see what happens. The other thing we do is a lot of automation. And so if you're abusing your power, it's really hard to use the automation. So if you're doing a lot of manual things, then it starts tripping, some alerts on why are you behaving that way. So a couple of things that we've done. And then just, having a lot of training and awareness just to let people know we care about that, because half the battle is just keeping the honest people honest.
Absolutely, we do the same thing. Identity management is a very important thing, and if your company's not big enough to have a resource like that, it is an important tool where even the people who are the watchers or the administrators don't have those rights. They have the right to ask for those rights. And we do that for everything from a help desk role, trying to step into a store to do something, versus a system admin that wants to become a domain admin for some function. And then using automation, not just in the logging, but also in alerting, and figuring out what events are important enough that when you alert, they go to some other party to let them know that that's happening. So the domain admin account was checked out, the supervisor of that area knows, but also the security person knows. So that division of labor, so it's all a team and a very visible thing. When you build a culture of visibility, the Noah's Ark approach, then people just understand that's the way we do business, and it really changes behaviors. It takes away the temptation for mistakes or for misbehavior.
So like these guys, we have Privileged Access Manager that we utilize. And so you have your normal business user account and then also a privileged account. And there's capabilities within it that it'll log and it will track everything that you are doing with that privilege or elevated access. And then it'll also give, a recorded session, so we can record the session too. But I think the key piece is, when I first started talking with some individuals, they'll say, oh yeah, well, we log this, or we log that, or we have audit logs. But if you're not doing anything with that information, then it's really not a great control. So you need to have triggers in place to where if there is something being done that is maybe suspicious behavior or malicious behavior, you want to have some sort of trigger that's going to go back to maybe our original question and trigger an investigation. And you're kind of looking into it and seeing, okay, are they doing something, or maybe has their account been compromised, and you can kind of dig a little bit further.
Okay, very good. As we are nearing the end of this presentation, I'm going to ask really what I believe is the hardest question that's been asked so far. So this is my Dr. Phil moment. Who's familiar with artificial intelligence, machine learning, robots, or bots, as they call them in the finance world? It's basically software that can emulate human behavior. So the question for this group is, in our new world of artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotic process automation, how does your organization protect against profiling and biases?
I think it's a great question, and I think maybe it was all of our favorite question. And the thing with machine learning is you're giving a data set to what's called like neural nets, right? And so it's going to learn something, and you're trying to use it to predict some kind of behavior. And a great example that I heard was a while back, Microsoft decided they were going to try out this experimental chatbot that they were working on, and they called it Tay. And they wanted Tay to learn very conversational speech patterns, and so they wanted it to interact with 18 to 24-year-olds on Twitter. And come to find out, the individuals it was interacting with had other ideas, so they trained the bot into learning racial and sexual and anti-Semitic slurs. So it was not a great program, but there's different ways that you can actually train, for machine learning. It can be either supervised or unsupervised. So we have a couple initiatives right now that are kind of going on, and with some of the lending practices, we have different regulations we have to meet, and so we have a whole fair banking group in our organization, and so they're trying to make sure that we're lending based off of creditworthiness and not necessarily race or religion or other factors. And so with some of the initiatives, they're part of the group that's supervising, I would say, some of the decisions that are being made and making sure that it's equitable-based decision-making. And so they're kind of keeping that oversight and governance in place.
One thing about these technologies is learning where you apply them and making sure that where you apply them is consistent with your values as a company. One kind of principle I've heard at Hobby Lobby is just don't be creepy. The relationship we have with our customers is a very important relationship, and we don't want to violate that. So we're not going to be the kind of company that says Fred bought glitter last week, so when you walk down aisle 6, we're going to suggest you go buy, I don't know what you buy with glitter, something else. We're not going to use that artificial intelligence to try to manipulate. Now, we will use technologies, and I will profile a computer that is doing bad things on the network. So I will deploy machine learning and automation systems to say if this computer is exhibiting malicious behavior, I will prosecute that with malice. But that is a different thing from an item to an individual. But really the key thing is these technologies, we say they're automated, we say they're machine learning and artificial, they're built by humans. That means underneath them are assumptions that have been made by humans. And so we have to be very careful at how we apply them, and we make sure that they're consistent with our values.
Yeah, I really liked Kent's point there about the fallacy that they're created by humans. So they're gonna have the behaviors and biases that humans have to some. So understanding that, talk about it, bring something like that to a diversity, equity, and inclusion group in your organization, and just get it on the table so it can be used for good rather than driving poor process or eliminating opportunity for people, because it's going to happen in a way that you won't recognize immediately, and it's because it's going to happen faster than it happens with humans because we automated it.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add to that. I mean, it really is, bad habits are learned by humans, and humans will help fix those bad habits as well, right? So I love the idea of a diversity committee stepping in and having those types of conversations. I will offer up an interesting case study if you guys are interested in doing some reading. It turns out a couple of years ago, a small country, about the size of Oklahoma actually, in Eastern Europe called Estonia, tried to use AI for their courts. And they were actually running cases through and using artificial intelligence as the judge in the case. And as they went through that test, they found out, hey, our artificial intelligence bots are racist. And as it turned out, as they dug down and looked at the actual algorithms that built how this thing interacted with the world, there were some things based off of historical cases that led that bot to believe that it was more likely for this type of person to behave in this way. So Google that, take a look at it. It is really interesting because you talk about you're going to turn over an entire data set to this thing for it to learn from. If there were racist practices or profiling practices in that data set and just how the humans used to do it, the bot's going to learn from that and try to implement the same thing.
That's powerful. Thank you. Last question. How does environmental, social, and government, so ESG, coincide with cybersecurity ethical discussions?
I mean, I probably come at this from a different perspective because Hobby Lobby is a private family-owned company, so a lot of the push for ESG, it's an interesting thing. Go look at the usage of the phrase in Google. You can look for words and how often they're used. I actually looked this one up. It didn't exist until it suddenly starts creeping up 2017, 2018, peaks in like the fall of 2021. The places where it's searched most often, New York and Washington, D.C. I don't think the ethical centers of our society. The concerns, just an opinion there. The concern I have about ESG is it's really a phenomenon where there is an outside entity trying to push a value on a particular company. I think it's important for a company to know what it values itself, and then to act consistently with that. So the intention of having a set of rules, I honor and think is a good thing. I just want to make sure that as individual companies, we know what our values are, and they come from places that we think, because really an ESG system you can game an ESG system like you can game any other system. Tell me how you pay me, I'll tell you how I behave, and that's an old human process. And so making sure that what we do, be it cybersecurity, be it legal, be it marketing, whatever it is, it has to come from a place of values that are core.
Oops, sorry. Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's almost kind of used as a marketing tool today. And, how do you validate those statements? And that there is certification processes that are kind of, in place. And so I used to work for a Big Four organization. And, if there's a way to audit something, they're going to probably make money off of it. So, I think that's probably what's coming. And so it's looking at it from a perspective of, all right, if you're saying that you're doing one thing, are you really doing it, and are you going kind of through the certification process? It's probably the ethical piece. I think for cybersecurity, it's really going to fall for us within that governance section, right? And then to kind of take it a step forward and look in the future, it's probably going to become more of a topic when it comes to privacy, and how are you protecting the privacy rights of your clients and the consumers that use your goods and your products. And so that's going to become more and more, I think, applicable to it. We had CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, that was passed a couple of years ago. And then there's a couple of other states that have followed suit. And then I believe that there's a bill in the Oklahoma House right now that's being looked at. And so it's becoming a much more popular topic. And so it'll be interesting to see how organizations start to kind of, respond to some of the things that are coming out from the legislature, and kind of adding that into their ESG statements.
Good. Ever so careful.
Yeah. Yeah. Absent the risk Kent mentioned where you're gaming the system, I think it's a good way to tell the qualitative story of what you do. We get asked all the time about, how many barrels of oil do we produce, at what margin, and what's the outlook for our capital program and things like that investors want. And so we have a set of data that goes into the investor decks that people decide to make investment decisions. But on the other side, the qualitative, there's a lot of companies that produce oil and gas. So we get to talk about how we do it. How do we protect the environment? How do we approach challenging things like diversity, equity, inclusion? How do we govern our programs so that the shareholders can trust the financial statements we put out? Cybersecurity is a part of that. And so what I like about it is when it's done honestly, when it's done ethically, it's a great place to tell that qualitative story about how you're accomplishing the goals of the organization. And so I've been really happy to be able to contribute to that over the last few years, as cybersecurity has been a growing piece of that.
So this is an interesting topic for government. I'll harken back to something Kent said on a previous question around outside influences and how they changed how you interpret things. Within state government, if it's the executive branch, you kind of have one voice, right? There are two other branches of government that are explicitly set up to counter, right, the whole checks and balances thing. That was a brilliant idea. Except that our adversaries don't necessarily distinguish between, hey, that's the legislative branch saying something. Executive branch doesn't have anything to do with that. The reason why I bring it up is in recent sessions, we've had some bills proposed that didn't fare well with some of our adversaries, anonymous. And if you'll give me just a little bit of leeway here, a few years ago we had a bill that we referred to as the hoodie bill that basically made it a felony to commit any crime if you were covering your face in any way. When that caught on with the press, Anonymous took huge issues with it because that's their calling card, right? They have the Guy Fawkes Max, and immediately started a distributed denial of service attack against OK.gov. Luckily, our federal partners had said, hey, we're picking up something on this, and we'd actually been able to prepare for it. And what could have been a catastrophic attack on the state, actually, I think we had some slowness for about 15 minutes because of our good industry partners there. But if you think about how other organizations or other individuals, if they're given a microphone, may impact your organization, it brings up a whole different perspective on ESG.
Very good. Thank you. All right, so we're a little bit over, but I hope you appreciate the content and the depth of the answers. The questions were wonderful. So I'd like to thank the panel, and we very much appreciate you taking your time to spend with us today. We appreciate the audience. Your questions were phenomenal. And thank you for having us. Lynn, thank you for having us today.